if an EMP, you mentioned it would take just a couple of nukes to basically EMP the entire US.
Yeah.
If that were to happen, describe what you think like how the events would unfold for after that. Like what people would
Sure.
expect to
Yeah.
experience and how, reactions, the whole nine yards.
Yeah. It's complicated because we haven't had something of that scale, but
Sure.
we're very dysfunctional. If COVID taught us nothing else, it's that we as a nation are very dysfunctional, and maybe the world is. But my guess is that if an EMP, let's say, went off over the eastern seaboard or somewhere, even central United States, most people would have no idea what was happening for quite some time, right? They would just know that there's some strange things happening. My internet's not working anymore, and maybe the power's out. What we having a blackout? It would take some time, and it would be difficult for the government to disseminate accurate information. Now, there
Right.
might be some information disseminated, but I doubt it would be accurate for some time, right? And so there'd be a lot of confusion, and of course there'd be the hardcore, we're under attack, and head to the hills. Those people, as well as people on the opposite side, going, "Oh, relax, it's just a blackout. It'll be back in a couple hours," right? And it would take, I think, a couple of days. But within a couple of days, if you didn't have power back, people would know that something was amiss, right?
Right.
Especially if it was widespread back. It wouldn't take out the whole US, but it might take out a big chunk of it. And if you knew a big portion of the United States was without power for a couple of days, where now all of a sudden your basic infrastructures are failing, the hospital generators are starting to run out of power, all these things are starting to happen. I think you would see our infrastructure start to collapse. Once people realized we're in a really bad situation, it may be like a Katrina situation where people said, "I got to go home and take care of my family." Right? I know I'm a police officer, but my family is number one to me, right? And so you'd have people, these infrastructures sort of collapse. And once people couldn't get fuel, you'd have people inability to flee. So the roadways already jammed with defective cars and damaged cars. I think things would lock down pretty quick. And there would be a lot of chaos, and it could quickly devolve into some kind of an anarchy kind of situation. And if our government was, really right and ready, maybe they could National Guard the thing and somehow keep order. But I'm just not a believer, and I love our country. I just don't believe we're that well organized. And so I think there'd be a period of time, maybe weeks, where people were kind of having to figure it out on their own. And I think that would be, the old and the ones that are most susceptible would suffer the worst, right? People who, needed their medications, or people who needed healthcare or whatever, needed various services that they couldn't get, would really suffer. And where it went from there would really be depend on how our country was able to respond, right? If we couldn't bring back up electricity for, let's say, a couple of months or something, there's only so much we would do. We could distribute, emergency food and emergency water and stuff, but it would be, we'd be a third world country for a while. And I don't think, people are so fat, dumb, and lazy nowadays. I don't think we do that great at that. With all that said, there's a certain portion of the United States, just like in every country, who would say, well, time to pull it together, right?
Yeah.
And they would manage, they would learn how to stay fed and how to stay clean and how to, not get taken over by the people who are super desperate and stuff. So I don't think it would wipe out everybody, unlike some predictions. But I do think there'd be a certain group of people who did okay, and there'd be a lot of people who did not do okay. And hopefully we won't ever get there. But that's kind of my thinking.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. You mentioned like the number, a lot of people would be wiped out and that there's different predictions. So one day I was looking at the EMP, reading the EMP commission report, and, the 90% thing came up. And I was like, where did they get this from? And so I went down the rabbit hole on trying to trace it back to where, or I was like, is there a study? What was it?
Mm-hmm.
And I believe where I ended up going was that a congressman cited 1 second after. And then that got in the congressional record. Do you know anything on that? Like, have any data
No.
where that actually comes?
Yeah, I don't know. Dr. Peter Pry was part of that report.
Okay.
I met him. He's since passed away, but I never had a chance to ask him where that number came from. He was very much of an outspoken, we should be prepared for this threat, and took it very, very seriously. I think the 90% is probably a little pessimistic, just because of, again, we as a people, we as human beings have been through a lot and been through worse, and we're pretty smart. I mean, say what you want, people know how to survive. They can figure it out. Now, the longer it went, the worse it would be, right? Because even the strong among us start having troubles and so forth. But I don't know what the number would be, and it would depend on how much the Earth was affected, right? If our allies were still up and going and doing okay, then we could expect we'd have aid, right? And there would be people bringing all kinds of aid in that would try and keep people alive. So it just depends, I think, on if it was a global thing and this was part of a global destruction-y thing, which is possible,
Mm-hmm.
or if it was a localized and maybe it is just big portion of the United States that's affected. That might not be as bad as if it was global, because then everybody's trying to take care of their own backyard, right?
Right.
So I don't know. I like to think that even under the worst case where everything's gone to hell in a handbasket, a significant portion of people, I don't know what number that is, would still figure out a way to live and survive. So
I like
I'm probably
that.
optimistic.
Yeah, yeah. Who knows? Maybe the answer is somewhere in the middle. I like that though, and I've thought that a lot. You mentioned it. Humans are resilient in a lot of ways. We don't think that we are, especially given all the political strife going on. But like you said, we survived a lot worse
Mm-hmm.
conditions. I could see cities having, I grew up in Los Angeles, so I could see cities like Los Angeles and New York having problems if the food system stops, and there would
Sure.
be some wildness. But I think overall we're pretty resilient. Two questions. Number one, what will be damaged if there was an EMP attack? I know we've talked, about
Mm-hmm.
smaller electronics and large stuff. And then what will work after an EMP attack?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So an EMP again is that E1, E2, E3. So when we say EMP, we're talking about all those together.
Mm-hmm.
So E1 can damage pretty much anything small scale with sensitive electronics. Okay. It's not going to damage, a heavy duty generator or a motor or, something with windings. There's not enough time for the energy to overheat windings and things like that. But it can sure zap transistors and blow out, your dash on your car and your ignition system and, the complicated things. And, cars have hundreds and hundreds of controllers on them, and certainly some would be damaged, right?
Sure.
So E1 does all that stuff, computers and cell phones, and it could cause damage to any of those. E2 is really more like a lightning kind of thing. It probably wouldn't damage that much, honestly. It might come in on some conductors, some wires, maybe through your cable system or maybe through the power system and cause some damage. But I don't think it would be the most destructive part. And then E3 again is this very slow, over seconds, minutes, maybe even hours of this energy flowing over these conductors. And that would damage anything that got that energy, just about period, including heavy duty things, because you just slowly overheat the windings. There's lots of time to do it. And so what I tell people is that things that are unplugged, they're just by themselves, whatever it is, if it doesn't have modern electronics in it, it's probably perfectly fine. You couldn't do anything with radiated energy to hurt that.
Right.
But if it's plugged in, it's probably able to be damaged. And if it uses modern, electronics like my phone here or something, it's got a very good chance that it could be damaged as well. So if you look around your house, most things fall into one of those categories. There are some that don't. You can find some things that are unplugged and just sitting somewhere. Let's say a bathroom heater. It's unplugged and sitting on the counter. It's not going to get damaged. It's so simple. It's an on-off switch and a power cord, right?
Right.
But many of our things, our televisions and our computers, they're just so computerized now. They're very easy to damage. And there are lots of things we can talk about you can do to protect them, but it's a pretty wide range of things that can be damaged by an EMP.
Well, yeah, no, we'll definitely get into protection here in a minute. And so once something's damaged, it's damaged because the EMP, E1, E2, 3, it burns out its transistors, it fries wiring. So once it's done, unless you have the ability to replace those parts and know what parts are damaged, it's done, right?
Yeah, if damage is done, damage is done. There's no, it doesn't self-heal or anything like that. Now, there's cases where it might just upset a computer, right? Maybe the energy throws some bits in the memory and the thing gets all confused and shuts off or goes into a weird mode. That's very likely, I think, especially in vehicles. I suspect that if an EMP went off, many vehicles would stop or have some upset. Maybe your dash would start going bananas. But if you stopped and shut it off and started it back up, it might come back up okay. Or especially if you disconnected the battery and let the system come down, reconnected the battery, many cars might actually recover. And it's something worth knowing to try that. As long as the damage hadn't been done to the processors, they were just upset in some way, you probably could recover. because they have these bootable prompts. They know how to come up safely from a power
Right.
outage. But if you did zap some of the chips and damage that damage is there, and how the system would handle that is sort of, probably not very well. If the computers start going out, you usually have a lot of problems. So
That makes sense. Um, Something that concerns my relatively uneducated mind on this with the grid down scenarios is the nuclear reactors. Everybody talks about
mhm.
I was I maybe 10, 9. I don't know how old I was when 3 Mile Island happened, and then
Yeah.
Chernobyl in the 80s, right? So
Mhm.
um what would a grid down event, what would the impact be long term on nuclear reactors? I mean,
Yeah.
how
Yeah,
would
that's a
that work?
great question. I looked into that a couple of years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago now, and I wrote a little paper. If you search the web, you'll probably find my paper. Um, and I asked the question, what's a long-term blackout going to do to our nuclear power plants? And I didn't have the answer because, nuclear power is a very specific technology. So I called a nuclear power plant and I got a hold of somebody who was pretty knowledgeable. And I cite him in this paper. And I asked him these questions, well, we just had a big EMP. And the big threat is not so much that the EMP is going to damage a lot in the power plant, it's that it's going to
Right.
kill power.
To the
And then you're
plant.
no longer able to cool the rods in the nuclear core there, right? And
Sure.
that's where it all goes bad, right? Once they overheat, they start to explode and they melt down, and you have all these problems. And so I did a lot of research into that, and I wrote a paper, and I don't remember all the details, but the short of it was this: I came away feeling okay about it. There's about 100 of these nuclear plants, these nuclear reactors around, and I asked him, what do we do when the power goes out? And he says, well, the good news is we have a few levels of fail safes. Okay. And he kind of walked me through it. He said, the first thing to know is we have the ability to generate our own power on site. We've got massive building sized generators we can run. I said, okay. And he said, we can run those things for quite a while. We keep fuel on site enough to run them for a while. And we can cool those rods long enough. It only takes several days. We can cool them enough that we can open the reactors and put them into storage. The storage are these giant water tanks with boron in the water, right? And that's where they keep all the spent rods, by the way. They have to keep them for years in these cooling tanks. And what happens is, like in Fukushima, is if you boil that water off, then the rods can't keep cool and they explode, and you end up with lots of problems. But anyway, so he said the good news is we've got generators on site; they can keep things cool. I said, well, that's great. What happens if the generators are damaged by this EMP, though? He said, wow, next level failsafe. We have portable generators we can bring in very quickly to essentially keep the system running long enough to cool those freaking rods and get them in the pool and keep the pumps running in the pool. I said, well, okay, that's pretty good. What happens if we can't get fuel to the portable generators or something happens to the portable generators? What are we going to do about it? He said, well, the good news is that these systems are almost self-fed. The heat that comes off the rods can turn the turbines, and you can kind of semi-cool themselves with just a little bits of energy in it. So there's that aspect of it, but he didn't seem fully convinced that was a full solution, but it was something to know. He said, but worst case worst is we blow the dams or whatever, and we flood the nuclear power plants. That's our last resort. These are built near water reservoirs that can flood them for that reason. He said, but consecutively, these protections are to ensure that we never end up in a case where this thing's just uncontrolled melting down and we have no way of cooling these rods, right? I thought, well, that's pretty good, and they have other fail safes, like, for example, these dead man systems where when power is lost, it immediately cuts the reactors off. They don't wait for a man in the loop to go, oh, we've got a problem. There's just an automatic cutoff thing.
Right.
And so they have thought this through. I mean, of what happens if these blackouts occur. But as you pointed out, there was Chernobyl and there was 3 Mile Island. It's not fail-safe proof forever, right? You can have failures occur. And those were very specific cases, I know, where some tests were being run and all that kind of
Sure.
stuff. But Fukushima was not. Fukushima was an accident of the Earth getting in the way of our plans, right? A big
Yeah.
tsunami. And it just shows to me that despite our best planning, you can end up in a scenario where it just gets away from you and you can't get to it to trigger all your fail safes, right? You can't get to it to put generators because it's too radioactive or whatever. But with all that said, I think if a normal, like an EMP were to occur, I don't think our nuclear power plants would melt down. That's the conclusion I came away with. unless an enemy wanted them to, right? If just like in Russia and Ukraine, if Russia wants to make their nuclear power plants, melt down, they can have it. They can bomb them, and they'll be unable to stop it, right? But then it destroys a portion of the Earth for essentially forever, right? And I don't think Russia or anybody else really wants to do that. And so, well, short of maybe like the leader of North Korea, most people would consider that insane.
Right.
So as long as we don't have an enemy with no regard to the long-term viability of the planet, probably that wouldn't happen. And we could keep our plants running, at least safely enough. They might not generate electricity, but at least they wouldn't melt down.
No, that's good to know. That's more
That's my
reassuring.
hope.
Like,
Yeah,
honestly,
I'm
I
too
was like, oh,
optimistic.
because I look at, I look at the map of the nuclear reactors here in the U.S. and I'm like, oh, I wouldn't want to be anywhere east of the Mississippi. Like it'd be crazy.
I'm 6 miles from one, and
Oh,
I'm
are you?
like, oh my God. But I'm just telling myself, believe what you say, and I do. I mean, I believe
Sure.
it. And I actually think nuclear power is a great thing, at least until we develop a better power system, some fusion related thing or something, just because it prevents all of the coal burning and all of those problems that we have as well, right? But there are risks to it. I mean, no question about it, there are risks to it.
We talk about like, especially with on the E3 wave where that would really hammer our transformers and stuff. And you hear, you read reports that, oh, well, they have to manufacture our big transformers in Germany, this and that. What do you know about your thoughts are on getting the grid back up? Like how long
Yeah.
that would take? Do we have any capabilities here in the US? What's on that?
I don't know the specifics, to be honest. I heard the
Okay.
same things you have, that these transformers are made overseas and we have very few spares. And people think transformers, they're probably thinking of things out on their pole or at their local utility station. These are enormous things. These are buildings, right? So it's
Yeah.
not like, oh, we'll just drive up with my truck and put up a new transformer. These are gigantic things. And so, what I had heard is that there are very few spares and they take up to a year to manufacture. And so we would have a period of time without those transformers. And transformers just convert from one voltage to another voltage, but you need them because you can't run your house on 10,000 volts or something. And so I don't know if it's true, if it was a widespread damage to, lots of these transformers, then I suspect there would be portions that they just could not repair for quite some time, right? There's just no way. I mean, maybe they find some patches. They can get in and repair things manually without replacing them. But I don't know. I suspect it'd be difficult.